Hello, welcome back to Worst Church Ever. Welcome, Nathan. We've been on a brief hiatus, necessitated by, I guess you could say, family and personal needs, but we are back and worse than ever. Welcome.
That's right. That's right. Existential crisis for me and for Chris every other week.
Hello and welcome back to Worst Church Ever. I am Chris.
And I'm Nathan.
And we're two lifelong friends navigating the intersections of the secular and sacred in this space every Monday, and all the days between in the course of our daily lives as husbands, fathers, and followers of Jesus, rejecting fundamentalism and exploring cycles of trauma and healing in the redemptive stories of Scripture and in the reflections of the sacred all around us.
So grab some baked goods and a cup of coffee, because it's time for a discussion at Worst Church Ever. Add your thoughts and comments online, and don't forget to subscribe so we can keep the conversation going.
This is Good Friday that we're recording this, and I have been going through an existential crisis this week, Chris, because it's been about 2 years since I was involved in serious worship-related artistry around this particular week. And so I was thinking about my place in the passion narrative and what that means for me in the place in life I am right now. And I guess that's not existential crisis as in like my entire life, but it was a big part of my life. And so the way that we interact with the passion narrative, depending on the stage of life we're in, something I'm thinking about.
Do you want to say anything more about that?
Yeah, I guess just the thought that there's ways that we interact with the Gospels and ways that we interact with Jesus. And one of the ways that I have done it has been leading music. And so Easter or Good Friday services and being a part of the instrumentation and the singing together of people, and not just participating, but also leading those interactions was always a big part of my life for the past few years. And now it's not. There's a little bit of an emptiness. There's a little bit of a void. There's a little bit of a question of how can I reclaim what it means to be part of that story and what it means to like invest in that story without having hundreds of people singing along with the same songs, or preparing some songs and playing them and rehearsing with a band, and thinking about which ones are going to bring out the right narrative and which ones we want to skip this year because we've done them too many times and all that sort of fun stuff. So
yeah,
I guess there's also a little bit of loneliness because there's this friendship and this camaraderie amongst musicians, and to have that in conjunction with Holy Week is just kind of cool.
Yeah.
So it's a little bit of loneliness, but I get to do this too, so that's fun.
Yeah, that is fun. Yeah, thank you for sharing. I appreciate that, and I think also, I'm wondering if there's the camaraderie you mentioned and the sort of placing yourself in the narrative, but there's also the act of creation that goes along with making music and with creating, not just playing the notes and singing the songs, but putting together the flow of what people are going to do together. And that takes a lot of emotional investment to do. And then to not do it is also something that I'm guessing that you're missing.
Yeah. I think there's a lot of people that are in ministry that feel burned out, but they don't know that they're burned out, because they're just like literally running on survival instinct at some level. And I would imagine that this part of life after Thanksgiving through Easter is like burnout central for anyone in ministry.
Yeah.
Because between the Christmas productions and the things that people are doing to get family services together, and then all through Lent into the Easter celebration or the Resurrection Sunday celebration, it's a lot of work. And I don't think a lot of us realize just how much we're giving until you don't give it anymore. Not this particular instance, but there was a few years ago when Elle and I were first dating, and I had been involved in so many things, and she just kind of challenged me of whether or not I needed to be involved in all that and date her at the same time.
That sounds like, but I'm sure it wasn't an ultimatum, because we don't do ultimatums.
It wasn't an ultimatum, but it was one of those like, hey, you might want to make a decision about what's important to you. And it wasn't necessarily like divisive or angry or anything like that. It was just, hey, if you want to have a future with a girl, you probably need to, figure out where she fits into your life. But I remember like giving up a lot of stuff, and I entered into a really deep depression. I didn't realize how burned out I was.
Yeah.
It was just like having space to actually not do things for a little while. And I think I spent maybe a year in emotional recovery because I was working full time. I was in school full time. I was basically filling in because I was at a church that lost a youth pastor. So I was like their surrogate youth pastor. And I was running a college career group at our church at the same time and trying to date a girl at the same time, right? So it's like 7 full-time jobs. And
that's too much.
It was too much. And yeah. So I entered into a severe depression after it. And my body wasn't able to process the grief and the depression and all the other things because I was in survival mode because I was just doing everything. Wow. So if you're in that space, if you're listening to this and you're in that space, it doesn't mean you have to necessarily like quit everything, but like give your body a chance to recover is really important. And I think that's why things like Sabbath and holidays, time off, and all those things are really, really important. And don't feel like you need to do everything.
That's really good. That's really good. I am, so I've been at my church now for 8 years, which means I'm a year past like a sabbatical if I were to take one. And I've been thinking about what does that mean? And trying to figure out and process my own timeline and my own, level of burnout, and where do I find myself having creative energy and where do I find myself really feeling spent? And I don't have any answers, but it's something I'm thinking about a lot. And part of me feels like our church has grown a lot even throughout the pandemic. And part of me feels like to go to the next level, to use like a terrible term for ministry, but to go to the next level, to grow more or to do more things well, or however you want to put it. I almost feel like I need some kind of break, but I don't know where to find that. I'm not sure where that fits in with the overall life of the church and with my family life and everything like that. And part of me wonders, if I take a break, will I go back? And I don't mean like to that specific church, because there's nothing wrong with that church. It's a great community, and that's not what I mean. I hope if anybody's watching this from church, I'm not talking about you, but in general, take it to a very generic level. Like if you are going full bore in ministry for 7 years, 8 years, 10 years, 30 years, and then you have that break that you mentioned, well, what does it leave time for? What does it create time for? What space does it make in your spirit, not just in your mind or in your body? And what does that mean for what you feel compelled to do once you've had the rest and the restoration that you need? So we are really good at ignoring Sabbath. And it's funny because so often it's people who are like, I believe in a literal 6 days of creation and the 7th day of rest, who are the ones who are like cracking the whip that like the pastor has to do more and the music minister has to be better and like the church office has to be more and there's a degree to which all that is true. We always want to be better. We have to be professional because we're public facing. We're accountable to the community. We're accountable through our charter to the state, right? So all these different things. So that's all well and good, but you know what I mean? There's people who, we talked about this weeks ago, the Protestant work ethic thing, well, if we have an excellent ministry and we have full pews and we have 5 or 6 campuses, that really shows that God's blessing us. But the only way you get there, for a lot of people, it seems to be, you work 60, 80, 90 hours in ministry and you're neglecting the ministry at home and you're neglecting being filled up by the Spirit and finding space and finding rest. And so it's quite a conundrum. It's quite an inconsistency for a lot of people.
I think that people that are in full-time ministry often are in places where they pour out more than they actually have, and they don't have anybody pouring into them either.
Yeah.
And they may have their family that's pouring into them, but if you're listening to this and you're not in full-time ministry and you know of someone who is, that's ministering to you, I'm just going to advocate, go minister to people in full-time ministry. Even if you don't believe in full-time ministry.
Yeah.
Even if you don't believe in religion, if you see somebody that's in full-time ministry, they need a friend.
Yeah, they do. Yeah, they
need
do.
Friends. They need people they can actually not have to be pastor to 24/7, 365 days a year. They need somebody they can just kind of, kick back and watch a football game with and let loose and maybe even just talk about how much they hate their job. Just like the rest of us do.
Well, that's a good point. Yeah. I mean, we're human after all, right? And we have all those same anxieties.
Pastors aren't allowed to hate their job, though.
Right. Just like baseball players, right?
And just like baseball players aren't allowed to hate their job.
So you had a power outage this week, right? Up in Maine.
Did.
And you're recovered from that? Everything's good?
It is. It was kind of weird. It's spring now, and we had this massive snowstorm. We got like 3 or 4 inches. Okay, it's not massive. Like 15 inches would be massive. It's 3 or 4 inches. That's not a big deal. But then it freezing rain for like 12 hours or some ridiculous amount. So all the tree branches were so heavy, they just started coming down everywhere. It was like a war zone.
Yeah.
It was crazy.
I remember, this goes back, I don't know, 12, 13 years. We had a big storm on Halloween, a big snowstorm. And it was kind of surreal because you're not used to that. And all the leaves were still on the trees. So all that heaviness of the snow on the leaves brought so many trees down and power out everywhere. And I remember walking through downtown Allentown. I'd gone to a downtown church for some ministry meeting or something. And all of a sudden I came out of the meeting and it was snowing. And I'm like, what is happening? And it was this eerie quiet. It was very cool, but it was very strange, almost like pre-apocalyptic or something. But the way this connects to what we've been talking about is that we lost power at the church. And this is when I was working at a really big church, 1,000, maybe 1,000-ish members at the time or whatever, which is big for where we live. And we had no power. And we got power back, but we had no internet. And we all sat around in staff like, how can we possibly do ministry without internet? Because everything's in the cloud and everything, we're reaching out through Facebook.
Can't even read the Bible without the internet.
And it was funny because, and I was in my, I guess, early 30s, and we had some people on staff who were in their 50s and 60s. So I go to them and be like, what did you guys do? How did you do? Tongue in cheek, but still, it was like you kind of get so so ingrained in your routine, and it's like, all right, if I do the routine, I put in the inputs, the outputs will come, and then that routine's taken away. You need to think to yourself, oh yeah, maybe there's a lot more to this whole thing than like typing really strong emails and writing good sermons and like having really great worship graphics and all that stuff.
It's true though. I mean, I think COVID did the same thing to all of us across the country. It's like, whoa. Like, we're not going to be allowed to get together anymore for a little while. And I don't know how it was in the states that everyone's listening to here. In Maine, they actually had, restrictions. You could not meet in public settings, and churches are included in public settings. It wasn't saying you couldn't worship. It just, you couldn't meet together in a public setting. I think it was a limitation of like 4 people that weren't family members couldn't get together. And so it's like, well, they're not going to, we're going to have 4 people here and call that a service. So we did a lot of online worship and online attempts. I think a lot of churches started live streaming. And I was actually reading an article, I think it was a New York Times article. It's not just churches. This also has impacted school districts. So absenteeism since the pandemic has gone up like 2 or 3 times as much as it was pre-pandemic. And this is across every social stratus. This is rich and poor. This is rural and urban. And it was just saying that it's caused significant disruption to the education world. And some of it's like, people adapting to what the new world looks like. And some of it is, if my friends aren't there, why do I go?
That's interesting. One thing that's increased is people doing like cyber school and things like that. So that's an interesting outgrowth of the pandemic. And I've noticed, I don't know about in Maine, but in Pennsylvania now, at least my older 2 children, both of their schools, they're much more hesitant to call a snow day because now we have flexible instruction days, which we didn't have before the pandemic, where it's like, listen, log in for the live stream during homeroom or morning meeting, and then you can be asynchronous the rest of the day, and then just check in at the end of the day and hand in your work. And it's like, we used to call those snow days and you would do nothing except go sledding. And now that it's an asynchronous day, so they don't lose a snow day, which is good, but you also, you want to have a snow day here and there.
Yeah, there's this unexpected delight that everyone has when they just get a free day off and they just get to make snowmen or like just chill and watch Superman the movie, the original, mind you. But the surprise and delight of a free day off is nice every once in a while.
That's right.
And when you get to be an adult, it's not as pleasant. I will say that. Good news, all the kids are off, and you still have to do work.
That's hard. That's hard because the kids want to play, and you want to play with them, and you want to go sledding. But it's like, I have to log into work and do this, and you get to go have fun. And I'd rather be having fun.
I have to finish these TPS reports.
Michael Bolton.
Yeah, that's right. I think that a lot of the ways that we interact with people and a lot of the ways that we interact with church and community and all these other things is changing.
Yeah.
I think there's an area that it's not changing. Sports has not changed. You can't play tennis long distance. You can't play soccer, baseball, football, long distance. There's, video game, I think esports are on the rise. Those actually took off, and there's a lot of that in prevalence. But like physical sports that you need to do on a court, that really is one of the communities that I found during and post-pandemic that really hasn't changed a whole lot. The family-oriented nature of kids getting together and playing, or adult pickup leagues, or whatever it is, you can't get out of like doing that in person.
Yeah.
But a lot of the other stuff, it's like, if I don't have to go to it, why do I go to it? I think you're missing something, though, if you don't ever see people in their native state, so to speak. I love doing this with you, but it would be great just to sit across the table with you. We did that a couple of years ago when I visited Allentown. We actually had a meal together, and that was so needed. I don't know that we'd be doing this right now if we hadn't had that moment.
Yeah, that was really, really important for our friendship, for sure. And it was just great for, both of us in lots of ways. We had burritos. It was awesome.
And you gave me a reintroduction to our town.
That's right. Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
Which is important.
Right. And I was driving around the other day, and I was like, man, even since I've come back here after college, things have changed a lot. So, it's really interesting to think about that context and what people will notice and not when they come back to visit.
I left before I got my driver's license.
Yeah.
And I think the way that you perceive the world pre and post driver's license is considerably different.
Totally.
And I don't know, your oldest has gone through that, and I'm going through that with my son right now. And it's interesting to watch that transformation happen, where the first couple of times he does the route, like, I need to remind him, like, you need to turn right here.
Yeah. Yeah.
Seriously, you need to start slowing down. Like, the turn is coming up. And now he's starting to understand where things are on the map.
Yep.
At least his brain is starting to map things out a little differently. And I don't know, we were driving around Allentown. I was like, wait, the fish hatchery is next to that?
Yeah. That's right.
How did I not pick up on that before?
Yeah, that's right. And also, like, everything seems like it takes forever when you're a kid. So, like, maybe it's a 10-minute car ride, but to you, it's like an hour,
Yeah.
And it's like, well, are we there yet? We just left.
Yeah. That's a universal. I'm glad that you have that experience too. We'd go to New Jersey for Easter Sunday or Good Friday services to my grandparents' house. And it was only like an hour away because they live outside of Camden. But man, it seemed like it was like 4 days worth of travel to get to my grandparents' house for an evening or for a morning.
It's over the river and down the turnpike, and to grandmother's house we go.
And that's why they say time is a construct.
Yeah, well, and it's relative, right? Which is the crazy thing about relativity, is that they believe that they've proven time and again that it's, that it's not just your perception, but it's actually the passage of time itself on an atomic level, which is nuts. The faster an atomic clock is flown in a plane, the slower it gets, or something like that. Like, in a literal way, that's nuts.
That movie Interstellar, with the gravity of that one planet where they're near the black hole.
Yeah.
They ended up spending like an extra 45 minutes to try to save this thing. And like, they come back and the guy's like, 45 years have passed or something like that. It's just insane.
Did you ever watch Star Trek Voyager? Were you?
Yeah, of course.
Yeah, I thought so.
The best one.
Yeah. It's
I don't know if
good.
it's the best one.
People hate it, but I love it because it was different.
I think you and I now, being as the age that we are, it's having a renaissance, and people are actually respecting it more.
Yeah.
Yeah. That was a great movie.
Yeah. The episode where what do you call it? I mean the series, right? Voyager, this with Janeway.
Oh, I thought you meant Voyager, the fourth Star Trek movie.
Oh, the
where
Voyage
they go
home.
back in time.
The Voyage
home.
home.
I thought you were talking about like whether they go save the beluga whales.
Oh no,
yes, the Voyager.
No, I love that.
Voyager, the series was good too. Yeah,
but you're right; they both
them.
involve time displacement. But in Voyager, the series, they have a similar thing where they go to this planet, but on the planet, time passes way more rapidly. So they can only send the doctor because he's a hologram and he won't age. And so he ends up like in the space of a few hours, he comes back and he's like, yeah, I've lived decades down there. Like I have a family and like I have a career and like all this other stuff. And while they're up there in the atmosphere of the planet, the people on the planet can observe the ship. And they don't quite know what it is because they're basically like a Stone Age culture when Voyager shows up. But in real time, they've been spending a few hours, Voyager has, in the atmosphere, but down on the planet, it starts to become hundreds and thousands of years. So Voyager, which is like this bright, shining object in their atmosphere, becomes a cultural touchstone for the culture of the people because they don't know what it is, but they know that it hasn't always been there. And they remember when it came. And so they start to develop technology and it becomes part of their lore, and it's really cool. So
I don't remember that episode.
Yeah,
I
it's a
remember
good
the
one.
one. I remember the one from Next Generation where Picard gets trapped inside of like a like some sort of distress beacon that
Yeah.
transports him to this world, and he basically lives out his entire life in this like alternate version of himself, and he has like learns how to play the flute and stuff, and that comes back a number of times, which is that same idea of like stretching time.
Yeah. Now, when we did, I think one of our very first episodes, we talked about the whole UAP phenomenon, right?
Oh yeah.
And I started to think about, like, why am I so interested in that? And I realized that it's because if we have some kind of quote unquote proof that the world is not just what we see, I think that's really fascinating, because that opens up so much in a more scientific way than we've been sort of allowed to think about. And I don't just mean spiritual things, but anything, temporal things and dimensional things, whatever it may be. I feel like we'll get to a point in society and in the history of technology where we'll have to say, like, yeah, we've thought since like the 13 or 1400s that the only things that exist are the things that we can actually experience. But you pointed out to me, I don't know if it was in a podcast or if it was just in a conversation, you pointed out that like the very idea that our senses are trustworthy is, we have no way of actually challenging that. And
Yeah, that's a
moving outside.
philosophical idea. That's not a scientific idea.
Yeah. And no one wants to hear that,
I was listening to a podcast. I'll give credit to Stephen Wright. He has the Philosophize This podcast. The very idea that as a human being, that the world is a rational place, the universe is rational, and that as a human, I actually can observe that. That's not scientific. That's philosophical. That's Hume. That's,
Yeah. It can't be scientific.
Right. You're in the experiment, so therefore you can't actually use your own experience to prove that experiment,
Sure.
because
Yeah.
there's no control group for that.
Right. And I think big picture, as long as, we kind of like know that, then go on and do science and go on and trust your senses. Like, absolutely. I mean, and it's really interesting because I think about the early Christians in a lot of ways as being the first to make a big deal out of this, because they're like, the tomb was empty and we saw it, that it was empty. And then,
Trusting my senses.
and Jesus showed up to us and we saw that he was there, that kind of thing. And Paul even says, like, he's like, well, Paul is really good at, even though he wasn't like a witness to the original resurrection itself, Jesus appears to him on the road to Damascus and he has that experience, which obviously you could say, oh, that was a hallucination, or that was this, or that was that. Doesn't matter. The point is, for him, he believed it was real because he experienced it in a way that was sensual, not sort of non-sensual, right? And he says, if that wasn't true, if Christ is not actually resurrected, this is all meaningless. And that's a very sort of modernist statement. It's like, if X, then Y, and then Paul goes to great lengths to make logical appeals as to what it means. That's most of what his writings are,
I was thinking about that the other day because, Paul's not that far off. I mean, there was a number of years, hundreds of years that were separating him, but like Paul in some ways is very Socratic, very Plato-esque.
Yeah.
He's coming at it from a place of education, a place of philosophical understanding. I'm guessing he'd read Plato because if you read a lot of the things that are in his letters, there's clear references to like the cave and our understanding of how like, shadow play and all those other things. That's not to say that like Plato was necessarily indicating Jesus, but he's kind of borrowing some of that language because he's talking to people who are Gentiles,
right?
Who are versed in Platonic understanding of philosophy and understand Socrates. And so, you speak that language because that's what people know. But I think it's interesting. I was thinking about actually the gospel accounts, and I don't know if we're going to talk about Mark at all today, but I was thinking about Mark specifically because a lot of scholars look at Mark as maybe one of the first gospel writers.
Yeah.
And if you think about Mark wasn't one of the 12 disciples. So historically and traditionally, we don't have direct evidence for this, but the historically and culturally a part of the church story is that John Mark might have been the author of that, and John Mark was a companion of Peter,
right?
And so John Mark was probably listening to Peter talk about his experiences with Jesus, and then again, historically, Peter didn't write this stuff down, probably because first of all, he thought that Jesus was coming back within his lifetime, so
that's
I don't really need to write down anything. And then secondly, he died. He was martyred, so he may not have had a chance to write things down. And I guess third, and this is something I actually hadn't thought about till this week, but we're talking about Paul and talking about Peter. Paul being more of the philosophical, like grounded, educated person. Peter was a fisherman. I don't know if this is true. I have no proof for this. He may have been illiterate.
It's possible. Yeah. Very possible.
He may not have had that grounding in philosophy and writing and reading that Paul had.
Yeah.
Because again, it's not to say he didn't. He may have. There's writings of letters attributed to Peter, but that could have been things that he said and someone transcribed for him.
Sure.
So it's a good possibility that just didn't occur to him to write down his gospel account because he couldn't read and write.
Right. Yeah, that's very possible. And what we don't have a good sense of, I think, is the degree to which first century Judaism, people who were growing up in Israel, Palestine, that area, obviously knowing the scriptures would have been of prime importance, but they're still, sort of at the tail end of the oral tradition having primacy. Now, don't get me wrong. I mean, post-exile, the written Torah and the Talmud became very, very important, but we don't know the degree to which common people,
Fishermen.
were able to access that. And there's a reason that the people who are named as religious professionals in the New Testament are called scribes. What does a scribe do? A scribe writes, right? So yeah, that's really an interesting question that we don't really know the answer to.
We've talked about this before, but the proliferation of literacy didn't come until Gutenberg.
Right.
And even after that, because the height of illiteracy is probably when Gutenberg invents the movable type.
Yeah.
Right. That there's more people that are illiterate in the world at that point in time than any before, because there's just more people.
Right.
And it takes a little bit of time for this technology to actually influence and change things. And so we're talking about the span of a few hundred years before literacy starts to really truly make its mark. We live in a place where we just take that for granted, that people have literacy and that they read and that they can research and they can go back to their notes and can look at the internet and search for every single little bit of information that's there. That wasn't how things were recorded for the most part.
That's right. And technology, even when it's paper and a pen, right, becomes an extension of your mind and an extension of your brain. And you know where to find your information, so you don't have to store as much. And this actually has a present day application, because people are talking always about what does it mean to augment our bodies with electronics and Neuralink and AI and the singularity. And you have people who say it's terrible, don't have anything to do with it. And I understand that approach. And then you have people who say, well, wait a minute, all we're really doing is offloading more of our native processes to technology. We've been doing that ever since we started scribbling in the dirt. I think it's an interesting philosophical question between those two sort of approaches. I don't know that I want to be plugged into the matrix, but at the same time, I sure would like to live long and prosper. So I don't know.
I guess that kind of begs the question, what is the brain doing when it has to process this information? People that don't have literacy have to memorize in order to get it. And so a lot of the oral tradition, we've talked about this before, is sung. It's songs and it's, community stories, and it's things that you kind of pass down from generation to generation. And now we have writing, and so you don't actually have to do that. So what are we using our brains for then?
Yeah. It's a really fascinating philosophical question, and also, ethical and spiritual and everything else.
Yeah.
But you're right. So much of the way that we remember things is through song and through rhythm. Last night we had our Maundy Thursday service, and my son, he's 16, and he was with me. And I don't know how it is in Maine, but right here, right now, the allergy season is terrible for a lot of people. And so he couldn't sing because he was like, choking up and dripping and the whole 9 yards. And he said to me afterward, it sucks to go to church when you can't sing. And I was like, yeah, you're kind of do that a lot. And he goes, it's kind of like what we do most. And I was like, yeah, I guess we do. Every church is different, but a lot of our services are very much focused on song. And it makes me stop and think, if you're somebody who can't physically participate because you're sick or because of some other, limitation, disability, how accessible is what we're doing for you? Or if you're somebody who doesn't like to sing because you're embarrassed that you think you can't sing, how much of our worship experience are people missing because of something that you or I might take for granted that is easy to do? But we're going to sing. It's an interesting, little diversion from the conversation, but I thought about that in reference to Holy Week, because on Easter, which is just in a couple of days, I think we sing on Easter more than any other day. And could that actually be a hurdle for some people? I never really thought about that.
I'm a person that likes to sing, and I like to play an instrument, and so it works really well for me.
Yeah.
If we're singing a lot, because that's fantastic. And it's somewhat a participatory activity, right? A lot of people either can listen to or participate by singing. So I like the participatory nature of song. I think that, and man, you're somebody that brings the sermon, so I'm not trying to be critical of you, but I do think that there is a little bit of an overemphasis that pastors put on the sermon portion, because, oh my goodness, I was in a church where they're like, well, the sermon really should be at least 65% of any given service, because we want to focus on the word of God. And I'm like, well, the word of God is Jesus, not. But anyway, that's an aside.
No, that's actually the point. Yeah.
The Bible contains the words "word of God," but that's actually a reference to Jesus, not the reference to itself.
Right.
I was thinking about like a traditional Catholic. We're Protestant, or I guess I was part of the Protestant denominations. But if you go back to more of the traditional Orthodox Christian traditions, like Catholicism and Greek Orthodox, like you think about the senses we were talking about. Like every single one of the senses you're experiencing in a Catholic service or in a Greek Orthodox service. You've got taste in communion. You've got touch with the passing of the peace and the greetings that you have with the other people. You've got auditory, where you're listening or singing out. You've got smell with the incense. You've got sight because of these beautiful mosaics of color and stained glass and just art that's all around you. Every single sense is engaged in some of those more traditional. There's a standing and a sitting, so there's movement, there's body movement of like. It's kind of weird when you're not Catholic. You can go to a Catholic church and you're like, wait, when do I stand? When do I sit? When do I kneel? It's really, everybody knows what to do. It's a ritual, and like the Protestant guy is like, oh wait, we're supposed to sit now? No, not just sit. There's a kneeling bench. Okay.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah.
But yeah, even the body posture and the physical sensation of all that sort of stuff is there. And I don't know that that's always in the Protestant churches. We were talking about this offline. It's like every Protestant church, whether you go to a Baptist church or a non-denominational church or somewhere in between, it's like you come in, you have an opening song, somebody gives the announcements, then you have 3 more songs, then the sermon, and then you have a closing song. And maybe communion like once a quarter or once a month, depending on which denomination you're in.
Yeah. There is at least that stuff, and it's funny because when I didn't have any deviation from that until I got into the United Church of Christ, which, is Protestant, of course, but in the Reformed tradition, there are elements of the Reformed service that there are things in between those that we try not to miss for theological reasons. Like there's almost always, and every church is different, don't get me wrong, and we have great autonomy to do whatever the hell we want, really, but at least when I write a service, I look back to some of the traditional Reformed liturgies because they always include a prayer of confession and an assurance of pardon, which I think is really a cool thing to do before you pass the peace, and especially before you have communion, if you're going to have communion. I've been in UCC churches where communion is once a quarter. I've been in UCC churches where it's every week, and it's really interesting, like the historical reasons why that's different. So in downtown Allentown, a church that was from the 1700s might, even into the 2000s, have communion every week because they had a full-time pastor for 300 years who could give communion every week. But out in the country, like 10 miles away, you might have it once a quarter because you were sharing that pastor with 4 other country churches and only the pastor could do communion. So that became part of your spiritual norm, And so when I came from the city church out to the country church in 2016, I was like, man, you guys don't care about communion at all. And they're like, oh, we do. We just don't have it a lot. I started thinking, why is that? And I'm like, oh, okay.
I had it wasn't a close friend. It was a friend of a friend. So it was an acquaintance. And he grew up in a Messianic tradition, which is, people that are ethnically Jewish who are also Christian. And I don't know this is Messianic across the board. They took communion once a year because it's Passover.
Oh, yeah.
And he was adamant. He's like, It's the Passover service, and it wasn't come up and get your wine, and they did the Passover.
Yeah, like the Seder meal. It's really something to think about, because I think for Christians, there's a lot that we miss if we don't understand the context of the Passover meal in what Jesus was doing and saying at the Last Supper. Even instituting an additional cup of blessing, that was a new thing, and you miss that if you don't know that Passover has 3 cups and Jesus added a 4th or whatever. So, and what happens in most churches is that becomes the pastor's job through explication and sermonizing to explain and fill in those gaps. But it does go back to what you were saying about some traditions being much better at incorporating all of the senses. And, obviously eating a meal is a paramount expression of togetherness and community. So, on Maundy Thursday, what we do at our church is we have a potluck meal from 6 to 7, and then from 7 to 7:30, 7:45, we have the liturgy part. But I try to stress, it's like, okay, now at 7 o'clock, we're having communion, but we've already had communion because we've been sharing this meal together. And when Jesus says, however often you do this, or do this in remembrance of me, I tend to think that what that means, at least for us, is whenever you eat and drink, like, remember that, like, your sustenance and your strength come from me, not in some weird, I'm going to lord it over you way. In fact, what does Jesus do at the Last Supper? He washes the feet of the disciples and, exemplifies what it is to be a servant. So, but at the same time, there's a real power and strength in every time you have a cheeseburger or a beer or whatever, a protein shake, like, being mindful and thankful that your real sustenance is coming from something outside of that. And maybe that's why we say grace as Christians, before every meal. I'm not sure, or at least we try to. But there's something to that,
What you're saying is absolutely true. Is like, no matter where you're getting your sustenance from, ultimately, if you're looking back to it and saying it's all from God.
Yeah. Yep.
And that's what I believe, at least.
Sure. And me too. Yeah.
Yeah.
So I think, and there's a real richness in learning from other traditions around the Eucharist or communion or Lord's Supper, whatever you call it. And I would include in that, the original context of the Passover meal. You're going all the way back, not just to Jesus, but to Moses, and there's a lot in those stories to wrestle with too. So
why would you say we call Good Friday good? Because if I watch Passion of the Christ, it does not seem like a Good Friday. In fact, with the exception of the Last Supper and some of those other moments that are very good, it is not good.
Yeah.
It is the worst potential day ever if you watch a person beat within inches of their life and then crucified, aka suffocated on a stick.
Right.
That is not good.
Yeah. It's the worst thing that we could do to anybody. It's the worst thing we could do to God among us. I think the theological reasoning is that the sacrifice was good. And obviously there are many theories of atonement and Christ's sacrifice and what it means and the efficacy of how it saves us. And we might even talk about how you don't have to believe that God has like an account book of all your sins. And then once Jesus is crucified, God takes his blood and metaphorically blots that all out. So Jesus dies so that God can love us. Like, that's one way of seeing it. Not how I see it, but there's many levels at which the death of God at our hands saves us, even if that's just psychologically, which I think is I shouldn't say just psychologically, it could be primarily psychological. And the reason I say that is because when you get over your obsession with having to be perfect, you can finally be good. And if Jesus himself goes to the cross and on the cross has his moments of anxiety and existential fear and even experiences separation from God, I think we've talked about this before personally, but I don't know if we've said it on the podcast, but the idea that God himself feels alienated from God on the cross. And alienation from God is the ultimate human reality in some ways. Like, we all have those dark times where we feel alienated from the holy or the divine or the eternal. Or we don't understand our role in the cosmos or anything like that. So we feel complete alienation from God. And it's only in the cross of Christ that God himself is actually able to know that exact same thing. So Jesus is, we say he's fully God and fully man, but it's in that moment that he's most fully both, even as he's alienated from himself and from God. And that itself might save us, because it allows us to see that God actually does carry the same burden that we do. And so God actually does stand in solidarity with us. And that itself frees us from having to be perfect, because even God has felt those imperfections and those anxieties. And so now that we don't need to be perfect, because the perfect sacrifice was made, and because that sacrifice was God himself, and God himself experienced all of our imperfections, now we are free to be good.
That is so good. That is so good.
That's what it's become for me,
That's so well said. Yeah,
that's why I keep going, honestly. That is why I keep doing what I do.
I think as you were saying that, I had this image of the civil rights era being broadcast on national television. And I think that was the first time where people had to confront racism and the results of racism in a profound way, to watch people get hosed down and killed just so that they could have equal treatment under the law. I think there was a big amount of people in the United States that are like, whoa, hold on a second. Like, it's not just somebody standing up and wanting to go to a different section of the bus. Like, we as a people are doing evil. When you see somebody good, Jesus, somebody pure, somebody who's righteous, who's a teacher, who's coming with one intention, and that is to have solidarity and love and friendship and fellowship, and then that person is crucified unfairly. I think it creates that opportunity for me to go, oh, that's what I'm doing. I get it. Okay, I can make a choice to do something else now. Like, it's that idea psychologically. I can release myself from it, because I can go, oh, that's the profundity of what I'm doing when I choose to be evil.
Yep. Yes.
It's the knowledge of good and evil, almost like pulled out of that moment of the apple and put onto the cross, and I'm able to see that's what you're doing when you promote injustice, when you like alienate people, when you're inhospitable. This is the impact that it has on other people.
Yeah.
I can see it.
The knowledge of good and evil in much Christian theology is the starting point of our problem, right? Like, we are damned because we covet and take for ourselves the knowledge of good and evil. Why does that damn us? Not because it's the one thing God said don't do. Not because we committed a sin and, somehow sins are unforgivable, which we don't believe. It's because when you claim for yourself the knowledge that is rightly only God's, and when I say it's rightly only God's, what I mean by that is not like God covets it, like only I can have this. No, it's because only God can handle it. Only God can handle the knowledge of good and evil, because only God actually knows what brought any one person to any one moment. Only God has all of that within. So what happens with the knowledge of good and evil is we damn ourselves with the anxiety of now having to navigate every single choice and all of the downstream repercussions of every single choice. And because we're not God, we screw it up. And okay, so the knowledge of good and evil curses us in that way, because we are no longer in ignorance, but we don't know how to be better than we are. So it existentially, psychologically, emotionally curses us. The knowledge of good and evil curses us in Genesis, and the knowledge of good and evil frees us in what you just said. Yeah. Because I have to actually, it's no longer hypothetical. I actually have to face the ultimate expression of abject evil in what we've done to one who was abject good.
Yeah.
So
I heard it said that the knowledge of good and evil is, again, to your point, having it isn't the sin, but prior to that, if you think about animals, and I'm not saying that we were necessarily animals, but like a bear, sometimes it kills other things, but it's not doing it with evil intentions. It's just acting on instinct. It's just doing things, right? It's protecting its kid. But once I actually understand that there are actions that have consequences, both good and evil, I actually see how my actions could hurt you, and then I can choose to do that.
Yeah, that's right.
I think that's what you're saying. Like, God can handle that. Like, human beings just can't handle the existential nature of that every single decision that I make could have an impact, good or bad, on other people, because that's just paralyzing.
Yeah. Yep.
That's what both of us have been dealing with for the past couple of weeks. This is why we haven't been podcasting, because Chris goes through his existential crisis one week, and then I'm going through another one the next week, where we're having these moments with, like, I wouldn't call it regret, but it's these ideas where there was something that was beautiful, it's not there anymore, or what do I do in the future to get that back? And it's a value decision. And, you know, we're in the middle of a midlife crisis, because that's what people do in their 40s, is they figure out, like, what do I want the rest of my life to do? So
yeah,
that's the challenge here, is that the knowledge of good and evil creates these moments where we're paralyzed, we're frozen in time, or we just can't even figure out how to do it. And so, like, Good Friday, that's so well said. Good Friday's good because I can actually see, I can see the choices. I can see the true consequences of choices. Like, it's all hypothetical until I see it.
Yeah. Yep. Yeah. And I think, I forget which of the Gospels it is, but I think Pilate says, like, basically, when it's time to, like, hand Christ over to be crucified, like, behold the man. And it's like, yeah, behold what you have done.
Oh, man. Yeah, Pilate was in a tough place. He could have taken different routes for sure, but he was certainly in a place where he was like, I don't really want to get involved in this. This is really not...
It's not my job.
I don't really think he's trying to overthrow the government. I don't think that's what he's trying to do. That guy Barabbas is.
Yeah.
He's actually trying to be an insurrectionist.
Yeah.
This guy isn't really that. So...
And how ironic is that the Roman prelate is forced to free the actual insurrectionist, whose name, Barabbas, means son of the father. And the son of the father, who is the innocent one, is the one that is put to death by the mechanisms of empire and human selfishness and all the downstream results of human frailty, you know?
Yeah.
Which were first exposed when we tried to go on our own and do it all ourselves, and have been overwhelmed with the paralysis of choice ever since.
Yeah. A lot of people will look at these stories, the gospel particularly, and say, well, you know, how do you have any proof that this stuff existed? Like, these letters and these stories, even the ones that are New Testament, weren't written down till 50, 60, 100 years later in some cases. And I think one of the things that I come back to in the Passion story is the alienation of Jesus, even to the point where his friends abandon him. And these are the people that are hypothetically writing the accounts. They see their own abandonment of the person that they shouldn't have abandoned. And again, this doesn't make it true, but I just have this idea that if I was writing that story, I might have cast myself in a better light. The fact that that's retained, it just seems to me to indicate a sense of obligation and a sense of, like, I can't get away with writing myself a better narrative because people kind of know that I didn't, and that this is part of what happened. And that proves, to me at least, some of the legitimacy of these stories. The truth of the human condition is that when things get hard, we tend to throw in the towel and let the chips fall where they may and run away. And also, incredibly good that we have that representation of people that just make bad choices just like we do and still are not beyond redemption. So,
Amen. Yeah,
you know,
absolutely.
Again, that's not ironclad proof that these stories are true, but it indicates the truth of the stories.
Oh, I love that. Yep, absolutely. Absolutely.
Yeah. Hey, before we go, I know we usually talk a little bit about, like, just other stuff, pop culture, etc. Maybe we could talk about favorite Easter candy.
Ooh. Okay. I like
favorite resurrection candy, depending on where you are on that issue.
Yeah. So you're from the Lehigh Valley, as am I.
I am.
The home of Peeps. It's where Peeps were made, invented. A Jewish family was the confectioners that invented Peeps. Props to them. I like Peeps, but they're not my go-to, you know. Our church has a tradition just in our local congregation where we make homemade Christmas candy and homemade Easter candy, and we sell it every year as a fundraiser for the ministries of the church. And it's actually like a really good time of fellowship making the candy and then like in the community selling it. And it's actually been really cool. They've done it for a long time. So they make some really good stuff. But I probably would go with like a peanut cluster egg or like those chocolate eggs that have like the crushed peanuts all over. That's probably my favorite. That's probably my favorite.
Yeah, those are pretty good. I don't think there's an Easter candy I don't like.
Right.
Peeps, they're making a recurrence, y'all. So if you don't remember the Christmas episode, we talked a little bit about Peeps. We're still open to having a partnership with Peeps if they'd like to sponsor the show. We're totally on board with that. So I'd be okay with the Peeps. Those are good. But actually, I'd say Cadbury eggs with the cream center are my favorites. I wouldn't say lust after them, but that's probably the closest word that I can say is I can't stop eating them if I have them. So I try to limit myself to like 4 or 8 per year because it's just like if I get a whole basket of Cadbury eggs, I will eat every single one of them.
They are
put
good.
The weight on.
That's a good call.
Do you guys decorate eggs
You know
still
what?
as a family?
Growing up, when I was growing up, we always did. And my grandmother loved doing it. And she would do it throughout the year, actually. Just like different times a year, she would do it. And she didn't grow up on a farm, but her family, her parents grew up on farms, at least on her mother's side. And so there's a lot of tradition there with like just the agricultural side of things. She loved it. We did it all the time with her. But then when I had kids, for whatever reason, like we did it when my oldest was really young, but it's not something we ever like made a huge point about doing. We always hid eggs, and we always had the egg hunts and Easter baskets, but painting eggs was just something that like, I don't know if it was like one more thing that like, oh crap, it's Good Friday, we didn't paint any eggs yet. Like, I don't know. We enjoy it, but it's not something that we like have really made that big of a thing. But I do like it. I wish we had, because it's a nice time. But
one thing that I think I want to bring back maybe at some point with my kids is my family always did these Easter gardens, which I don't know if that was unique to my family. I don't know if my mom got the idea from somewhere else, but you get like a baking sheet, the aluminum baking sheets that, like you put a casserole in, and you'd fill it with the nice soil, the potting soil that you get, and you put a couple of flowers in, but then you put in like a toilet paper roll covered with aluminum foil, and you can kind of create a little empty tomb scene with a rock in front of it. You put a little sign outside that says "He's not here, he's risen."
Oh,
but you
goodness.
have like these nice little flower arrangements that you do, and then you find some people in the community and you give them to them.
Oh, that's pretty cool.
Yeah, so that was nice.
Like that.
I might have to do that again because it's kind of fun.
That's really cool. That's really cool.
So anyway, I am really excited we could spend an hour on Good Friday together.
Me too. Yeah.
And thanks. So it was needed. I'm really glad to have that. I feel like my existential crisis is somewhat over now that I've spent some time in camaraderie with you thinking about this.
Yeah. Good. I feel the same.
Yeah. So thanks, man.
Yeah. Thank
Hopefully
you.
we'll catch up again in a couple days and get another episode out here.
Sounds good.
All right.
The world is clamoring.